The wool buyer set the check on the tailgate and did not look at her when he said it. 41 cents a pound. He told her the fleece off her flock was too coarse for anything worth having, and that she ought to be grateful the pool took it at all. 3 counties over, a man named Roy Ackerman stood in front of a room full of ranchers and said that Marta Voss had finally lost her senses, hauling good wool into a barn to grind it up like it was garbage. By the second week of that July, every pasture in the valley had turned the color of a paper sack. Cattle were being hauled to the sale barn at a loss. And on one bench of ground that the whole of Golden Valley County had watched Marta ruin, the grass was still green. She stood at the fence line with her arms crossed and her hat pulled low, watching the men who had laughed pull up to her gate, one truck at a time, to ask her a question none of them ever expected to ask. But to understand how Marta Voss ended up on the right side of that fence, we have to go back to the autumn of 2015. There is a rule in sheep country that nobody writes down and everybody follows. It goes like this. The wool goes to the pool. You take what the pool gives you. And if your sheep grow the wrong kind of wool, that is your misfortune to carry. Quietly, the way a person carries any other cost of doing business on hard ground. For most of the last century, that rule made a kind of sense. Growers brought their clip to a warehouse in the county seat every spring. A buyer graded it, weighed it, and cut a check. Fine wool brought a fair price, coarse wool brought less, and the men who ran the older range flocks. Big-framed sheep bred for meat and for surviving a bad winter rather than for soft fleece, learned to expect a thin envelope at shearing time and to make their money on the lambs. Nobody questioned it because there was nothing to question. The buyer did not set the price of coarse wool. The mills did. And by 2015, the mills that had once bought American carpet wool by the ton had mostly moved overseas or closed, and a coarse fleece had fallen so far in value that in some years it did not cover the cost of the man who sheared it. A grower sheared because the sheep had to be sheared, hauled the wool to the warehouse because that is where wool went, and drove home with a check that felt more like an insult than a payment. That was the rule Marta Voss had lived under for 11 years. And in the fall of 2015, she decided she was done living under it. Let me tell you who Marta Voss was because you cannot understand what she did without understanding what she had already lost. She was 58 years old that autumn. She ran 240 head of coarse-wooled range ewes on a bench of high ground east of the Musselshell River, some of it deeded, most of it leased. She was not a large operator, and she was a widow who had buried her husband, Carl, in the spring of 2013 after 31 years of marriage. A heart that quit on him in the lambing shed at 4 a.m. with a bottle lamb still in his hands. Carl had built that flock, picking the bloodlines himself, favoring hardiness over thinness. Ewes that could hold their condition through a Montana January and raise a lamb on grass that would starve a softer animal. He used to say the fleece was the least of it, that a sheep that could survive this country was worth more than one that grew pretty wool and died in the first blizzard. Marta believed him still. But after he was gone, the thin wool check stopped feeling like a philosophy and started feeling like a wound. She had run the books for 3 decades, and she knew that the wool, which should have been a second income, had become a line item she dreaded every spring. In 2014, she sheared 4,000 pounds of wool off her ewes and was paid $1,640 for it. The shearing crew cost her $1,100. She had worked a full week of gather, sort, and haul to clear $540 on a product her husband had spent his life improving. She started reading that winter, not casually. The way a person reads when they have decided that the answer is out there, and that nobody is going to hand it to them. She was not entirely alone in it. There was a woman named Dana Reyes who ran the soil lab at the county extension office, 30 years younger than Marta, sharp and patient. When Marta walked in one day in November of 2015 and asked whether raw wool could be used as a soil amendment, most people would have sent her home. Dana pulled a chair over and said she had been waiting years for somebody in this county to ask her that exact question. Here is what the two of them found, and it is the heart of this whole story. Wool is not a waste product in any meaningful biological sense. A fleece is roughly 9 to 16% nitrogen by weight, along with usable amounts of sulfur, potassium, and carbon. It breaks down slowly in soil, releasing that nitrogen over a period of months rather than dumping it all at once the way a synthetic fertilizer does. And it does something a bag of fertilizer cannot do at all. Wool fiber can absorb and hold many times its own weight in water, and when it is worked into soil, it holds that moisture in the root zone and releases it slowly as the ground dries. Coarse wool, the very wool the market had decided was worthless, is in some ways better suited to this than fine wool. The thicker, springier fiber breaks down at a rate that holds structure in the soil longer. The thing that made Carl's fleece a poor candidate for a sweater made it an excellent candidate for the ground. To turn raw wool into a usable amendment, you clean it, break it into pellets or coarse mulch, and work it into the ground. The pellets release nitrogen and hold water through a full growing season. Gardeners in Europe had been buying wool pellets for years at prices that made the American carpet wool market look like a cruel joke. A pound of wool the pool paid Marta 41 cents for could, cleaned and pelletized, be worth $6, $8, $10 to the right buyer. Marta did not have the right buyer yet. What she had was 4,000 pounds of wool a year that she was currently giving away, a barn she could convert, and a bench of leased ground that was tired thin and losing moisture a little faster every summer. So she made a decision that everyone agreed was grief getting the better of a woman's judgment. In the spring of 2016, for the first time in the history of her operation, she did not haul her wool to the pool. She kept it, cleaned it in a converted stock tank, built a simple mill in her barn to break it down, and began working her own worthless wool into the worst 40 acres she leased. A dryland bench that had grown thin grass and thinner hay for as long as anyone could remember. Roy Ackerman heard about it within the week. You need to understand Roy Ackerman, because he is not the villain of this story, no matter how much he behaves like one. Roy was 61 that year, and he had been the regional wool buyer for the pool the better part of 30 years. He was not a rancher. He was a middleman, and a good one. The kind of man who knew every grower in 4 counties by their first name and the name of their dog. His job was to aggregate wool. He combined the clips from dozens of small operations into volume lots large enough to interest the few remaining buyers, under a standing contract that required a minimum tonnage every year. That contract was Roy's living. The coarse wool the mills barely wanted was still tonnage. Every pound a grower like Marta pulled out of the pool was a pound Roy had to make up somewhere else, or fall short of a number he had committed to men in an office far away. So when Marta Voss stopped bringing her clip to the warehouse, Roy did not see a widow trying something new. He saw a hole in his tonnage, and he had a real, understandable reason to want that hole closed. He came at it the way men like Roy come at everything, not with a threat, with a laugh. He held court most mornings at the counter of the Sportsman Cafe on Main Street, and it was there, over coffee, in front of half the ranchers in the valley, that he made Marta Voss into a story. He would shake his head and say he had seen a lot of things in 30 years, but he had never seen a person haul good wool into a barn to grind it up and bury it in the dirt like a dog burying a bone. He would say Carl must be spinning in his grave. He would say, and this is the line that got repeated, that Marta had figured out a brand new way to lose money on sheep, and she ought to patent it. The men laughed. Not because they were cruel, because Roy was funny, and what Marta was doing sounded, on its face, insane. And a laugh at the cafe counter in a small county does not stay there. Within a month, Marta Voss was the woman who buried her wool, and there was not a soul in Golden Valley County who thought she was anything but a grieving woman making a sad mistake. Marta knew what they were saying, and she kept working the wool into the ground anyway, because the work was the only argument she had, and arguments made of words had never once moved a man like Roy Ackerman. And then the counter started running. In the fall of 2016, the owner of the deeded ground adjacent to Marta's, the same tired bench she was amending, told her he had an offer from a larger outfit to buy it outright, and that if she wanted to keep leasing the piece that her flock depended on for late summer grazing, she would need to match a lease payment nearly double what she had been paying, and she would need to have it to him by the 1st of August, 2017. If she could not, the ground would sell, the fence would move, and she would lose the only late-season grass that let her carry 240 ewes through to shipping. Without that bench, the flock was too big for the deeded ground and too small to be worth running at all. She would have to sell down to nothing. to let go of the last thing Carl had built. So now there was a date, the 1st of August, and a specific thing to lose. Not money in the abstract, but the flock, the ground, the last living piece of a 31-year marriage. Against it stood a single thin hope, 40 acres of amended ground that everyone in the county was certain she had wasted her wool on, and one growing season to prove it had been worth anything at all. The summer of 2017 is the reason this story is still told in central Montana. If you were anywhere on the northern plains that year, you remember it. The rain simply stopped. What forecasters would later call one of the most severe flash droughts in the region's recorded history settled over Montana in June and did not lift. Grass that had greened up in May cured brown by mid-June. Ranchers who had never bought summer hay were buying it by the semi-load at prices that doubled and doubled again. Cattle were sold off in the thousands. Wells that had never gone dry went dry. It was, by every measure the county kept, the worst summer in 40 years. And on Marta Voss's 40 acres of amended bench, the grass was green, not lush. Nothing was lush that summer. But where every other pasture in the valley had cured to paper and dust, the ground she had worked her wool into was holding. The fiber buried in that soil had spent the winter and spring soaking up every drop of moisture the ground received, and now, in the driest July in 4 decades, it was giving that moisture back slowly into the root zone, exactly the way Dana Reyes had said it would 2 years before. It had held enough water that the grass kept growing after every other blade in the county had quit. Marta grazed her flock on that bench while her neighbors hauled cattle to the sale barn. Her ewes held their condition, her lambs kept gaining, and she did not lose a single head to the drought that emptied pastures on every side of her. The men noticed. Of course they noticed. You cannot hide green grass in a brown county. They drove past slow, they stopped at the fence, and one at a time the same men who had laughed at the Sportsman Cafe began pulling up to Marta Voss's gate to ask her, hats in their hands, what exactly she had done to that ground. Roy Ackerman was the last to come, and he did not come to the gate. He came to the fence line on a still evening in the last week of July and stood on his side of the wire a while before he said anything, looking out at green grass that had no business being green. Marta walked over, and she did not hurry. Roy said her name. He said Marta. And then he said the thing that had been sitting in his chest for the better part of 2 years. He said he owed her an apology. He said he had stood up in the Sportsman and made a fool of her in front of the whole valley, and that he had been wrong to do it, and that he could see now he had been wrong about the thing itself. Marta let him finish. Then she said, quietly, that she remembered his exact words. She said, "You told them I'd found a brand new way to lose money on sheep." She said, "You told them Carl was spinning in his grave." Roy looked at the ground. He said that was fair. He said he deserved that. Marta looked out at her flock, grazing in the only green pasture for 20 miles. She said Carl wasn't spinning. She said Carl had spent his whole life telling this county that the wrong kind of sheep was worth more than they thought, and that the wrong kind of wool was too, and that the only thing she had done was finally listen to him. She said the wool was never garbage. She said the market had decided it was worthless, and the market had been wrong, the same way Roy had been wrong, and the same way the whole valley had been wrong to laugh instead of ask. Roy asked her after a while whether she would show him how it was done. He said there were 40 growers in his pool pulling coarse wool off their sheep every spring and taking pennies for it, and maybe there was another way for them to make a living off it. And maybe he had spent 30 years standing in the way of it without knowing. Marta said she would show him. She said she would show anyone who wanted to learn. And then she said the thing that ended the conversation and began everything that came after it. She said, "The ground was telling us the whole time what that wool was worth. We just kept hauling it away before it could." She made her lease payment that August with room to spare. The wool she had been giving away for 41 cents a pound, cleaned and pelletized, found buyers the moment the story of the green pasture spread. First gardeners, then a nursery, then a soil products company out of Bozeman that signed her to a product line. By 2019, she was buying coarse wool from the same growers who had laughed, at 4 times what the pool had ever paid them, and turning it into an amendment that ranchers across 3 counties were working into their own dry ground. Roy Ackerman helped her organize the supply. He never quite apologized in public, but he told the truth in private to anyone who asked, which for a man like Roy was the same thing. Now, let me tell you the part that matters most, because this is where the story stops being about one stubborn widow and becomes about you. The science under this story is real, and it is not new. Raw wool is between 9 and 16% nitrogen by weight, and research supported by the USDA and by universities studying wool as a soil amendment has documented that wool pellets release nitrogen slowly across a growing season and improve a soil's water-holding capacity. Wool fiber can absorb many times its weight in moisture, which translates into ground that holds water through a dry spell longer than the untreated soil beside it. The coarse wool the American textile market abandoned decades ago is, by the measures that matter to a plant, one of the most useful things a sheep produces. It was never waste. It was a resource an entire industry agreed to throw away, because the one buyer who set the price decided it was worth nothing, and everyone downstream accepted his verdict as though it were the weather. That is the thing worth sitting with. Marta Voss did not invent anything. She simply refused to accept that a product was worthless because the people who had always bought it said so. And the ground proved her right in the driest summer in 40 years. So here is my question, and I would like you to sit with it before you answer. Have you ever watched something get thrown away? A skill, a piece of land, a person, a whole way of doing things, that you knew in your gut still had value, while everyone around you agreed it was finished? Did you say something? Or did you laugh along with the men at the counter? Tell me below. I read every one.